Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to the second of today's sessions on housing and health. I'm Chris Neat, Academic Director of the National Center for Suburban Studies here at Hofstra, and an Associate Professor in the Sociology Department. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Martine Hackett, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Population Health, who co-organized the panels today and will moderate this discussion. Before we begin, I want to thank Kathleen Collins, Carol Mallison, and Janine Rinaldi at the Hofstra Cultural Center for working with us to organize, advertise, and sponsor this event in the midst of an incredibly packed schedule. For those of you who participated in the President's inaugural sessions last week, you know just how busy they've been, and yet they still made time to help us pull this together. And I want to again express our appreciation for it. I'd also like to thank my partners at the National Center for Suburban Studies, Executive Dean Larry Levy, Deb Tinarello, and Ina Katz for their support in the middle of a similarly packed schedule. They're currently preparing for the upcoming celebration of suburban diversity on December 6th, so be sure to save the date. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Hackett, to do to introduce the panel and the panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you everybody for attending today. I want to start off by just, recognizing something that I think we all already know, that where you live, your zip code, your block, where you put your head down at night, are environments that surround you. And as biological organisms, we are influenced and affected by our environment. The exposure of our environment and the reaction that our bodies have to them present as individual health problems, hypertension, asthma, premature births, and coronavirus symptoms. But these exposures also create population health outcomes. And when we can identify places on a map that have the highest number of positive COVID cases as neighborhoods that also disproportionately have essential workers, multifamily housing, immigrant populations, lacking health insurance, users of public transportation that have been historically disadvantaged, we know that we're not looking at a coincidence, but an embedded system that creates an environment that produces and reproduces poor health outcomes. This is true in the city, and it's true in the suburbs. What we know also by looking at the history of the United States is that when housing improves, when it's affordable, safe, and accessible, then it's a protective factor for our health. Today, the suburbs are home to the majority of the people in the United States, and the housing needs, particularly for affordable housing, has never been greater. These needs challenge and confront the suburban stereotypes and policies that support single-family zoning, home ownership, and racial segregation. With this multifaceted relationship between housing and health well established, we are now pushed to interrogate how the COVID-19 pandemic has reconsidered this relationship. For example, the eviction moratorium issued by the Center for Disease Control has saved the lives of over 10,000 New Yorkers, according to the Legal Aid Society. But with the moratorium ending, record high housing prices, and the persistent reality of COVID-19, we clearly need to continue the conversation about the relationship between the future of health and affordable housing in the suburbs, which is why we're here today. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our panel, and they will speak in the order that they're being introduced. And also just by way of level setting for the rest of how this is going to go, each panelist will share some thoughts and ideas around this concept of affordable housing in the suburbs. And then we will open up for questions, which you are welcome to type into the chat or raise your hand, and we'll be able to engage in a dialogue after they present. Our first presenter will be Elaine Gross. Elaine is the founder and president of Erase Racism, which fights the systematic causes of racial discrimination and segregation in public school education and housing. Her successful efforts to address housing discrimination include organizing a statewide coalition that successfully advocated for amendments to the New York human rights law and being the catalyst behind Newsday's groundbreaking housing discrimination investigation on Long Island that found widespread disparate treatment of people of color. This in turn was the catalyst for actions by the New York State Senate committees. Ms. Gross was invited as an expert to testify and provide recommendations that contributed to the 2021 passage of 7 laws by the New York State Senate and Assembly to increase fair housing enforcement. The laws presently await enactment by the governor. As president and CEO so that's Elaine, and thank you, and we will be talking more about that work that she has done in this presentation. Second panelist will be Gwen O'Shea as president and CEO of Community Development Corporation of Long Island, which she oversees the 52-year-old regional nonprofit, its 2 nonprofit affiliates, and numerous for-profit subsidiaries with over $31 million in assets, an annual budget of $35 million, and a staff of 90. Gwen works closely with the board of directors to set the strategic direction of the corporation and with the leadership team to implement this strategy by cultivating and growing its current business lines: rental assistance, resident services, home ownership center, home improvement and optimization, and real estate development. CDC Long Island's Community Development Finance Institution provides critical capital to underfinanced communities, multifamily developments, homeowners, and individuals. Over $10 million is deployed in loan funds. CDC Long Island is also a co-venture partner in 15 multifamily complexes, representing over 2,000 apartments, with an additional 278 in pre-development. CDC Long Island has developed 235 single-family affordable for-sale subdivisions and currently manages 43 single-family scattered site rental properties and a limited rent-to-own portfolio. Thank you, Gwen, for being here. And as you can just tell by those numbers, clearly CDC Long Island is a player in this game, and we're happy to have you here. And finally, Cottrell Lewis. Cottrell is a native New Yorker and is humbled to be able to say that he has assisted to help develop housing in New York City. In this capacity, he serves as a registered lobbyist and with direct oversight of government, community, faith advocacy, and campus partnerships. His work is resulted in important policy advances, such as the passage of the monumental City Council Community Land Trust Bill, investment in the New York State CDFI Fund, restructure of New York City's tax lien sale, introduction of a state community land trust taxation bill, and advancing historic legislation to reform the state's homeownership funding program. Prior to his work at Habitat for Humanity in New York City and Westchester in 2016, where he currently works, Cottrell has worked with the New York City-based nonprofits and political candidates on public policy and fundraising. Cottrell received his BA in political science from CUNY College of Staten Island and is currently pursuing an MPA with a concentration in urban development from Baruch's Marx School of Public and International Affairs. Welcome, Cottrell. We look forward to talking to you and hearing the benefit from your experience. So if we wouldn't mind starting with Elaine, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here with everyone today. And I am going to be talking mostly about fair housing, but I will be happy to contribute on the affordable housing front when we have questions. So the central question at the heart of the panel discussion for today is, what exactly is the status of fair housing and affordable housing in the suburbs? And using Long Island as an example, my very short answer is our federal, state, and local governments are failing. That does not negate the positive steps that have been taken by the Obama and now the Biden administration, nor am I ignoring the positive steps taken by the New York State Assembly and Senate earlier this year when they passed 7 bills that would increase accountability and enforcement of fair housing laws. By the way, those 7 bills must be signed into law by the governor before year end, and if you know her, please tell her to sign the bills. Especially when we add in the actions of non-government entities, such as banks and real estate agencies, we are nowhere near where we should be. So please listen to this. As stated in the United Nations Fact Sheet 21, entitled "The Right to Adequate Housing," quote, "adequate housing was recognized as part of the right to an adequate standard of living in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights." When Fact Sheet 21 talks about, quote, "key aspects of the right to adequate housing," in the section called entitlements, it includes, quote, "equal and non-discriminatory access to adequate housing." It further describes what is meant by discrimination. Discrimination means any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of the specific characteristics of an individual, such as race, religion, age, or sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It is linked to the marginalization of specific population groups and is generally at the root of structural inequalities within societies. It goes on, in housing, discrimination can take the form of discriminatory laws, policies, or measures, zoning regulations, exclusionary policy development, exclusion from housing benefits, denial of security of tenure, lack of access to credit, limited participation in decision-making, or lack of protection against discriminatory practices carried out by private actors. Non-discrimination and equality are fundamental human rights principles and critical components of the right to adequate housing. It talks about the obligation of states, we would say countries or national governments, to, quote, "prohibit and eliminate discrimination on all grounds." The governments of these countries have an immediate obligation to take steps which should be concrete, deliberate, and targeted to fulfill the right to adequate housing. It further identifies that, quote, "the obligation to protect requires states to prevent third parties from interfering with the right to adequate housing." This was printed in 2009 and reprinted in 2014. So why, you may ask, did I choose to highlight this UN document rather than talk about the US Fair Housing Act and the New York State and Nassau and Suffolk County human rights laws? Our laws in this document are quite similar. I was hoping, however, that because you may not be familiar with the international human rights law, you might hear these requirements with fresh ears and an open mind. And this is why I say that, because over the past 20 years, and my role as president of Erase Racism, I have done everything I can think of, whether it's research, legal action, policy analysis and advocacy, education of the public and organizing the public, etc., to get ordinary citizens and civic and government leaders to take seriously the obligation to fight housing discrimination with concrete actions. Individuals, businesses, governments must not be allowed to violate laws and carry out housing discrimination against people because of characteristics they hold that are named in our fair housing laws and which have been upheld in case law for decades. Those protected characteristics include race and ethnicity, among others. If they do discriminate, the punishment must be severe and specific enough that it keeps them from being repeat discriminators. And most importantly, most especially, we have also, for the past 20 years, stressed the centrality of affirmatively furthering fair housing. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 not only provides enforcement mechanisms to prevent discrimination in rental and sale of housing and remedies for those who have been discriminated against. Congress realized that simply prohibiting discrimination and redressing the injuries that occur when discrimination happens is not enough. The duty to affirmatively further fair housing is a critical component of the Fair Housing Act. It seeks to prevent discrimination and dismantle existing segregation. Specifically, affirmatively furthering fair housing means taking meaningful actions that, taken together, address significant disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity, replacing segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transforming racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and fostering and maintaining compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. As stated by HUD, the duty to affirmatively further fair housing extends to all of a program participants' activities and programs related to housing and urban development. So we have not done that. That's why I say that we're failing. So how do we know that our housing segregation in Long Island is bad enough that we need to actually implement AFFH? Analysis from the 2020 census tell us that on Long Island, the Black-white segregation, or the dissimilarity score, is 65.5. A score that is greater than 60 connotes severe segregation. The score, by the way, for Hispanic white segregation is 46.1 and Asian white is 43.4. When looking at Black-white segregation of 50 metro areas with the largest Black population, Long Island maintains its position as the 10th most racially segregated metro region in the nation. Long Island Hispanic white ranking is 19th and Asian white is 14th. We also take into account the results from a random telephone research study that we conducted in 2012, that was conducted for Erase Racism in 2012, which found that contrary to popular opinion, only 1% of the Black respondents said they only wanted to live in neighborhoods that were 100% Black. The remaining Black respondents preferred racially diverse communities. Most Long Island Blacks live in racially segregated communities, not because of a preference for self-segregation. And this reflects research studies that have been conducted on other areas, in other areas of the country. And if we had the money, we'd do it again, and I'm sure we'd find very similar results. We also take into account the evidence from successful settlements in erase racism, housing discrimination lawsuits, ongoing lawsuits from other nonprofits, and the findings from the groundbreaking 3-year investigation by Newsday that showed that Black testers received disparate treatment 49% of the time. That's almost half, as well as 39% for Hispanics and 19% for Asians when telling real estate agents they wanted to purchase a home. We see clearly that this segregation is not self-imposed by Blacks or happenstance. The federal government was the instigator with redlining policies, including in the late 1940s and early 1950s, with Levittown's racial covenants in the deeds, forbidding Black veterans from living there, while heavily subsidizing this exclusive, affordable housing for white veterans. In 1960, not one of the 82,000 residents of Levittown's 17,400 houses, not one of them were African Americans. In 2019, Blacks comprised about 1.2% of Levittown's population, even though they comprise about 10% of Long Island's population. So this was a national policy, and Long Island's residents and leadership embraced the federal government's policy of housing segregation. Nationally, between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion in home loans. Over 98% went to whites. The resulting structural racism is hard to dislodge, but affirmatively furthering fair housing, that AFFH mandate, can help So I've used my time to, I hope, educate some of the audience on just how insidious and persistent housing discrimination and lack of proper enforcement by our federal, state, and local governments. And this has tremendous impact. I hope that at least some of you listening today will take up the fair housing cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Now we look forward to hearing from Gwen.
Thank you, Martine. Thanks for having me. And she's always very difficult to follow Elaine. She is inspirational and committed and so factual in everything that that she presents. I want to thank you, Elaine, and we're so lucky at CDCLI. Elaine is on our Council of Advisors, and her insight and her inspiration is always so impactful. So I'm going to try to have a slight level of that in my comments, but I do want to thank you and Chris for having me today, and for all of you for participating in really such an important conversation. I'd like to just share some thoughts that sort of take a step back and look at the implications of the previous administration and some of the evolution that we've seen with the current administration, and how that has been driven and impacted by what we've seen over the discourse over the past year and a half, and of course what COVID-19 has presented to our communities. So taking a step back to prior, before the Biden administration took office, I think, and of course everything that I'm sharing is not going to be a surprise because we all have lived through this, but it's important for us to sort of, as we think about moving forward, really look at the context that we're dealing in. And I think there's agreement that one of the major pieces that came out of the previous administration was this divisive, me-centric culture that really honed in on a loss of power and privilege that was unearned for a certain segment of the population. And part of the discourse, the language, which we all know was really very much continuing to perpetuate prejudice, discrimination, inequity. And we see that today, not only in that area, but also as it plays out with the COVID-19 pandemic, that there is this me, what it means for me and what the implications are for me versus how do I play a role, Martine, to some of your opening comments, in assisting a public health crisis that is impacting, my community. And so a lot of that is still very much prevalent in all of Long Island communities. We see it through conversations happening at school boards and amongst school board members and parents and protests. And tied into that is, also this real huge loss of civility and this previous opportunity that we had where you may be coming from, whether it was a different political party or a different viewpoint, but there still was humility and grace and compassion and respect for one another, where you could sit around the table and have a conversation and allow for different voices to be heard and not necessarily criticized in a way that really paralyzed progress from moving forward. And I think one of the things we're seeing from the Biden administration and the current administration is a real desire and focus to try to not only bring back that civility, but also to look at, to some of the points that Elaine has brought up, the historical implications and loss of opportunity for communities of color that was very much driven by the federal government. And so, fast forward to today and what we're seeing in some of the COVID response policies, as it particular pertains to housing, there's some significant both funding and policy investment being made to try to right size some of the wrongs that have taken place over the past, 40 to 50 to 60 to 70 years. So first and foremost, we take a look at the affordable housing funding that is waiting to be concluded and approved, including the Build Back Better Reconciliation Act, which will include $330 billion, really looking at affordable housing and addressing, again, many of the disparities and discriminatory practices that we have seen. So just quickly, broad picture there It's talking about providing an additional 70,000 housing choice vouchers to New Yorkers, which we know in particular in a region like Long Island is a game changer for individuals to be able to afford housing that they choose in the community that they choose, and having the resources to really be able to have a financially stable household. We also see a creation of $9 billion. And again, this is just looking at what it means for New York, for expanding the National Trust Fund, home funding, and LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit resources, which again are extremely important for a region like Long Island, where we know the cost of living is extremely expensive, the cost of acquiring property is extremely expensive, and the cost of developing housing is expensive, because the term affordable is a relative term. And there's, as we all know, all of these misperceptions around it. The truth is, creating, when you're financed through the state or the federal government to create affordable housing, it's making it affordable at every income level. Right, so we all know that no one should be spending more than 30 to 40% of their income on housing. And that's regardless of if you're making $30,000 a year or you're making $200,000 a year. We need individuals to have access to save and to spend money, within their communities. And so having these type of financial tools to allow for good quality housing to be developed is critical. And then there's also a significant investment in creating new homeownership tools, in particular for an area like New York, to address racial disparities in homeownership and wealth, and strengthening communities overall. Elaine brought up an important piece that many individuals forget, which is our segregated communities and redlining was driven and controlled by the federal government, and that homeownership is the main way that wealth is created in working class, middle income families across the country. And we prevented communities of color from having the opportunity to do that by not subsidizing and supporting and financing homeownership in the same way that we did for white communities. So when we talk about looking at Long Island's housing makeup, or what sort of makes up our market, we have about 82% of our housing market is single family homes, which is much higher than our sister and brother surrounding suburban communities like Northern New Jersey and Westchester, where you have more of a 40 to 50% rental market, not single family homeownership market. And for Long Island, within that 81, 82% of single family homeownership properties, less than 23% of that homeownership is held by individuals of color. And when you look at, as Elaine pointed out, the makeup of our communities and how changed we are in terms of diversified, we have a huge problem in terms of offering the same opportunities for homeownership, maintenance of homeownership, and wealth building to communities of color. And some of the funding and the policies that the Biden administration is providing looks to address that. So for example, many of you are aware of the rental relief programs that are up and running. On deck from the Treasury is significant support for housing assistance for homeowners. New York State has received the second largest allocation from the Treasury Department in the neighborhood of over $500 million. And part of the policy and regulation that the Treasury has put forward is that there is a prioritization of what they're defining as socially disadvantaged. And those are historically, individuals, communities of color, and other communities that have not had the same access to capital and funding and financing. And that will be a priority when the state rolls out that program, to make sure that dollars go to those individuals and communities first. And while these are great infusions of funding and infusions of potential policy change, we also know as Long Islanders that programs, funds, policies are only as successful as the local implementation of them. And as a region that has more layers of government than we all probably care to talk about, that is really what is going to shift the changes that Elaine brought up and the changes that, we'll continue to talk about today. And so one of the big pieces, and CDCLI had a conversation, sort of a coffee conversation last week, that another colleague brought up that I have to repeat and sort of copy because it's so important, is the only way these policies, the funds that are available, are implemented successfully and comprehensively in our communities is by having the right individuals representing us to do that. And at the end of the day, it comes down to voting. So as we're getting ready for early voting and looking at, while many people are excited or normally are excited to vote at the national level and for the presidency, which of course is such an important position, with a region like Long Island, local elections are probably more important, in really ensuring that we have the right people at the table that want to hear and provide a space for community members to have their voices heard in terms of what they want to see as we look to create, a much more just Long Island. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Definitely gives us great points to put a pen in so we can think about going back to, especially around the proposed funding that might be hopefully be coming. And now I will offer the floor to Cottrell.
Great, thank you. This is my first time meeting Gwen and Ms. Gross, but I look forward to our engagement, and I hope that most of what I say kind of ties into what you both were saying. As I was already introduced, my name is Cottrell Lewis, and I am the Vice President of Government and Community Partnerships for Habitat for Humanity, New York City and Westchester County. And I usually have to tell people, because people always say, well, how do you build housing or affordable home ownership in New York City? So Habitat New York City has been serving New York City since the 1980s. And Jimmy Carter's first volunteer engagement actually was right here in New York City in partnership with the Habitat New York City affiliate. So we've been serving New York City since the 1980s, and we've been serving Westchester since 2020, since last year when we took over that GSA area. And in our time through our inception of our organization, we have served 1,900 families through development or preservation, which is really important, that we also make sure that we don't just talk about the development of affordable housing, but we can't develop our way out of our crisis. We have to also preserve the affordable housing that we currently have. We have to hold while continuing to build. As I said earlier too, I am a lobbyist for the organization, which means that I represent the organization at all the levels of government in New York City, and I haven't even dreamed of what Westchester government layers are. But for New York City, that is 51 city council members, 5 borough presidents, the mayor and his agencies, and on a state level, 63 senators, 150 assembly members, now the governor and her agencies, and about 12 or 13 congressional members. And I say that all to say, because as Ms. Gross was talking about fair housing, I say that it's important for me to say that, to then go into why we do this work and why I'm committed to do this work. And I say that Habitat is, and I will probably say, Ms. O'Shea and Ms. Gross work is the same. The work that we are doing is civil rights work. We might not be civil rights organizations, but I say that Habitat for Humanity is doing civil rights work. And that is because, as Ms. Gross was saying, tying it to housing to the United Nations, when I'm in community, I tell everybody all the time that I bring it all the way back to 1966. And all the way back, right? Like, my mom was born in 1963. So she was born in a country that did not respect that she should have adequate housing. I think we should start off with that basis, that we are only one generation away of Black people in America not having adequate housing. 1966, they introduced the Fair Housing Act, and it is filibustered. 1967, it was filibustered again. And in 1968, it looked like it was going to be filibustered again. It's only one reason why we got fair housing in this country. When President Johnson signed it, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act, he said that he would not receive or not see fair housing for the Negro in his lifetime. So we are now in 1966, and the only reason why we see fair housing is because of April 4th, the assassination of Dr. King. And every time I talk about it, it kind of gets me emotional, because we are only getting fair housing in America because of the assassination of Dr. King. We work on the blood-soaked soil of Dr. King. So whether we are talking about affordable housing or fair housing or home ownership or rental, we should always remember that this country only gave the Negro fair housing because a man was assassinated. President Johnson was right. He probably would have never seen fair housing in his lifetime if the country was not in an uproar and the cities in this country were not burning. He used that to push Congress to do something, which then tells us today, what are we doing now? We have a reconciliation bill that is huge. Maxine Waters started off a reconciliation bill with everything that was possible underneath the sun. $600 billion was her request. Right now, we're at $340 billion. This is unfortunate, but I believe that this is probably the most progressive and most ambitious housing program that we have ever seen in this country. We also are in a situation where we have the most ambitious and most aggressive Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in this country. Secretary Fudge has put a focal point of what we really should try to do in this country, which is her 3x30 campaign. And for Habitat for Humanity, this is our guiding star. And if you don't know what 3x30 is, it is, she believes that we need to get 3 million Black new homeowners by 2030. It's the most aggressive homeownership proposal that we have ever had from the federal government. As Ms. Gross and Ms. O'Shea has already said about the history of building the suburbs and building homeownership and what role that the federal government has played, we have never really put a pen to what is it that we are really trying to do in this country. So when we talk about reconciliation, you know, everybody always says, well, what's the number? What are we trying to do? And to me, we are, if you have $10 and you go to the store, you can buy $10 worth of stuff. But if you have $5, you cannot buy $10 worth of stuff. What are we buying with $340 billion? And what could we have built or bought with $600 billion? Right now, we are in a housing crisis all across this country. And the reconciliation conversation is about numbers and not about people, not about the $70 billion that NYCHA needs or $70 billion that public housing needs, with $40 billion just going to NYCHA. Because I can tell you right now, when it gets cold, those people will be living in the cold. We know that right now, that the heat will go out in NYCHA in December. And it is wrong for us to negotiate that number down, knowing that NYCHA needs what they need. It is wrong for us to know that people are sleeping in the streets when we need to build home ownership and housing. Every time we get past that $600 billion number, lower to 330, lower to 320, and now we're negotiating again, it is pulling away the foundation of the 1968 purpose that we all stand on. Again, we will all have a great time and a celebration of Dr. King work in January, but for the next 11 months, everybody always forgets, why are we celebrating? And it is always important for the people that do housing to understand that the foundation that we sit on is only because of that assassination. So we should cherish that work to really do and really push forward what we really need to do. It's not just numbers and a reconciliation. It is the real change that we can see in this country. I believe there is money in the reconciliation bill. It is $8 billion, like I said, for public housing, but it is also $4 billion for rezoning and initiatives for land use. It is new programs that Congresswoman Tlaib and Congresswoman Katchar created, which was Communities Left Behind Act, which would allow organizations to acquire new land and acquire buildings and recreate how they see their communities should be. So I'm very excited to start our Q&A. But for me, when I tell everybody the work of a lobbyist and an organizer, it is because the assassination happens April 4th, and they have fair housing to the president by April 11th. Working in government and politics, nothing passes that quickly. Congress can't agree on what day it is, let alone pass a bill in 7 days to get to the president's desk for signature. So I feel like we are in a very unique situation where we have a secretary that is willing to fight for affordable housing, who understands fair housing and affordable housing, but also a Congress who needs to pass a bill that is worthy of the American people. And then the states and the localities that is able to implement it. But more importantly than a state and a city, organizations like Habitat that actually do the work. The city of New York provides a lot of money, and I'm pretty sure, I'm not too sure about the counties in Long Island, but counties and cities and states do not build anymore. They leave it up to the private sector. And what we're saying is allow for us to build, to move people out of NYCHA, to move people into homeownership. What are we going to do about single family zoning in Westchester and Long Island? Where are we trying to be in the next 20 years as it relates to housing? Does community land trust have a role to play to give communities more authority over their own futures? How are we attacking gentrification across New York City and California and Westchester? These are big conversations that we should have, and it's bigger than, X trillion dollars in this $1 trillion, and we should drop that $1 trillion. We should have real conversations about our communities. And I look forward to the Q&A so we can start to have that real conversation.
Thank you so much, Cottrell. I think that, just sort of echoing what we've already seen in the chat, the real appreciation for you to be able to sort of demystify some of these numbers and what we hear or selectively hear about the reconciliation bill, and really putting just a human face on it, and really reminding us that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the assassination of Dr. King, and that we can't forget what sort of an extraordinary sacrifice that was to be able to have us be here. And so we can't give up, I think, is sort of what I'm taking from that. So thank you for that. And so we'll open this up to questions again. If you are, you're welcome to put chat questions into the chat or do the raise hand function. In the meantime, I will start the flow here by picking up a question. Actually, thinking about all three presentations and the recognition of policy change, which I think was certainly something that I heard across all these presentations, and the mention of the Affordable Furthering Fair Housing rule, and also the changes in California that Governor Newsom signed with bills that increase the density of formerly single-family neighborhoods. I'm wondering if the panelists wouldn't mind commenting on what opportunities do these type of developments offer for those of us who seek further fair and affordable housing goals on Long Island and New York, the New York area. Recognizing that, the funding, is to be determined, but what are some ways that we can see some of the things that already have been passed as inspiration / motivation to make change? I saw Gwen nodding, so I'm gonna call on you first.
Sure, and thanks. I was just thinking about, sort of what's kind of low-hanging fruit and tangible. So right now, at the state level, there is an opportunity to pass legislation related to accessory housing. And for a region like Long Island, that's important on so many levels. First and foremost, it's about recognizing the uniquenesses of every community, right? So for those that are thinking, I don't care whether it's luxury or affordable, I don't want to see, 150 unit development in my community because we just don't have the sewer and water infrastructure for it, or it doesn't fit with this facade. But we know because we have a disproportionate number of single family properties on Long Island, many of which are occupied by seniors or individuals aging in place that have limited incomes, challenges with rising property taxes, want to stay put, have space, but don't have the ability to build an accessory apartment or, quite frankly, legalize an apartment that they may already have. And by doing that in a way that also offers requirements of a certain level of affordability, we're providing more home opportunities. We're growing our housing stock. We're providing more opportunities for individuals in a diversified communities. So providing rentals in areas where perhaps there weren't really a lot of rentals before, and addressing, the economic issues that we know homeowners, renters, and smaller communities face. So that's definitely an area that could easily create, it's not going to meet our 150,000 unit need of new housing, but it certainly could start to chip away at a lot of the issues that we know Long Islanders are dealing with.
Thank you. Elaine?
Sure. So I would piggyback on what Gwen is saying and just add a little twist to it, which is that unless those homes are actually publicly advertised and available for a wide range of people, including people of color, to be able to move in, then that will not, at every point along the way, unless we're very intentional in dealing with fair housing, we don't really have access to housing for all populations. So we also have been supportive of the ADU, but only if it's explicitly tied to fair housing. The other thing that I would add, which is not unfortunately, is not a low-hanging fruit, but it's something we must talk about. And that is the fact that as a home rule state, and Gwen knows this very well because she builds housing, we have a real challenge with being able to build multifamily housing, which is how we're going to get housing that's affordable to a lot more individuals, because it's cheaper. The units are cheaper, and plus they can be rentals. And some people who can't afford to buy, can't afford to rent. So there is some conversation. Unfortunately, there isn't a bill to tell you about, but I hope that maybe in this next legislative session, there will be, because there is some kind of behind the scenes conversations going on with some groups and some legislators that we are involved with. And so I hope that we will be able to take some step. And there are different ways to do this. The current administration has put forward a plan that says automatically allow certain kinds of housing under the single family housing zoning. I would like that to be pushed up some, but I think it's going in the right direction when it says 2s and 4s and 6s. I would like to see how that can be. What's the number? Gwen might have a better sense of what's that number that is a kind of multifamily, but it's not 150. So that could be helpful. I would hope that we would consider that. I also hope that we would consider some of the other policies that are in other states, which have circuit breakers of one sort or another, either through a state agency where that can override local zoning if necessary, or giving some powers to developers that allow them to say, look, I've been unfairly denied, this was arbitrary, and now this means that I get to go forward with the project. None of these things are easy, and I don't want to suggest that they are, but there needs to be a lot more discussion about them, because we can't let the elephant just sit there and not do anything about it.
I would say to Gwen and Elaine's point, we are supportive of the ADU legislation. Habitat for Humanity is supportive of the ADU legislation on a state level. But I think the greater issue is that there is not enough units that we are developing across the state to serve the people. And that's why we're trying to look for everything underneath the couch cushions to saying, hey, maybe ADUs is possible too to also get people in. But what we should also look at is the subsidies that allows developers to develop. The government incentivizes through their subsidies, and then people like me and Gwen then develop. And it's really based on what is it that you are showing us that you want us to develop. I'll give you an example on a state level. I have a bill that's very similar to Elaine in front of the governor now, which is an increase in the Affordable Housing Corporation grant. The Affordable Housing Corporation is the only state subsidy for home ownership. Now, rental, you can have light tech deals or low income tax credit deals, and you can also have the housing trust fund. If you are developing home ownership in New York State, the New York State will provide up to $40,000 per unit for you to build or rehab every unit that we build. We build single family homes, but we also build multifamily. And with our multifamily, we build a 57 unit co-op in Northern Bronx. We receive $40,000 times 57. But if I was building rental, I would be able to tap into the housing trust fund and tap into $125,000 per unit. I'll say that number again because I always do. If I'm building rental, the state will give me $125,000 per unit. But if I'm building home ownership, the state will only give me $40,000 per unit. It incentivizes people like me and Gwen to only build rentals. Now, home ownership is hard, and Habitat is committed to our mission, so we build home ownership, but we need to start asking the question, where is it that people are pushing us to develop? And do we have enough to actually develop the units that we need? Because an organization that is like us, that is committed to serving low to moderate income New Yorkers, will try and fight hard to ensure that the mortgages that our homeowners are able to take on is affordable. It's very similar to the rents. The rents that a developer is going to develop and then push on, and a manager is going to push on to the renter, is based on what the balance sheet was looking at. The more I have to take on as a developer, the more I'm going to push on to the renter and the homeowners. And if we are not looking at, are our subsidies in the right place? We will always continue to have this problem. So our subsidy right now would increase, our bill would increase our subsidy from $40,000 to $75,000 for the housing, affordable housing trust fund. Every homeownership developer that I know in New York City says that will close my budgets immediately. It allows me to get into the ground. I can put shovels in the ground right now. But that $35,000 change drastically allows us to start to build more. Whether that is condos, co-ops, or single family homes, it allows us to streamline it much quickly. So we really have to start asking ourselves, why are developers in the ground longer rather than getting them to the closing table and starting construction?
You know, that's a really important point for people to hone in on, because what's tied into that when you look at cost of development is, where is the ease and the cheapest place to get it done? And what we know is that often happens in communities that are overly saturated with density, that are oversaturated with perhaps subsidized absentee, but quite frankly, low standard housing opportunities, perhaps not the infrastructure, water, commercial, retail tax base that they need to sustain. And so that provides a challenge of, you want to produce the housing, but you don't want to continue to produce housing in a small subsection of communities that already have their fair share. And so I do give, New York State through HCR, through their the low-income housing tax credit and some of their funding opportunities, that they do prioritize and have really shifted some of their policies to give higher scoring and access to capital to developments that are happening in higher opportunity areas. And the higher opportunity areas are defined as such of higher area median income, lower percentage of poverty, lower rental rate, lower rental percentages, looking at sort of the school metrics that the state has, higher performance in those areas. And so it's a small way, and doesn't necessarily get at all the capital that you're speaking to, but it's a small way to also incentivize developers to be looking in other communities. And we, as to your point, as a smaller developer, you know, are very thankful that with some of the private capital and investment that we have, are really now looking at acquiring from rental perspectives to existing rental perspectives to potential rent to own opportunities solely in high opportunity areas, which starts to open up again some of the opportunities for individuals and families that, you know, historically have been steered and pushed only to a handful of communities on the island.
And Gwen, that I'm happy to hear you talk about HCR in that way. I would like to see a more systematic approach of evaluating whether or not projects that receive funding are actually affirmatively furthering fair housing. And that conversation needs to be more prominent at the state level for sure, because we're not transparent about it. You know, how much money is actually going to further segregate housing, and what proportion of the pot is going to further fair housing. That's the transparency, and that's the conversation that needs to happen now.
Thank you. I think my colleague Chris has a question, a follow-up.
I just have a very quick question, because this you're addressing something that's adjacent to what I've been thinking about for a chunk of this panel, which is that when we consider subsidies, when we consider new funding for housing development in places like Long Island, I wonder if any of the three of you, but maybe especially Cottrell and Gwen, could speak to the challenge of convincing policymakers, especially at the federal and the state level, that the suburbs are important and that the suburbs need funding and have urgent needs. That it's all not, that we're not all healthy and wealthy out here. And I see Cottrell laughing, and I think that there are particular challenges when I've worked with Uniondale Community Land Trust that we've encountered being kind of a startup housing producer in a hot market, and dealing with state subsidies that are uniform, whether you're in Rochester or in Uniondale. You're capped at $40,000 per unit, and raising it to $75,000 is helpful. But there still remains a broader problem that, when we have total development costs for Cape Cod and Uniondale that are $500,000, and in Buffalo or Rochester that are in the five figures, many policymakers are going to say, well, this other need is more urgent and we can make a bigger impact with the same number of dollars. What combination of advocacy, organizing, and development do we need to kind of move past that? Or is there a way of moving past it?
I think it's coalition building. So Habitat is, as you know, Chris, because we met in a coalition, right? We are consistently always in a coalition or organizing a coalition, but coalition building also includes knowing how to whip count, right? I am not a senator, but I can whip just as good as the majority leader, in her whip, right? Being able to say, listen, I am able to get 10 senators to agree on this issue. And a perfect example is Senator, I hope I get his name right, Gorin,
New York State Senator Jim Gorin.
Yes.
You got it.
Yes. So he is a member of the minority, but was a sponsor, original sponsor of the AHC increase bill. Generally, I have not seen many members of the minority on a member of the majority's bill. But he thought that home ownership was important in Long Island. And he bucked his party, and he was one that was able to, in his conference, convince consistently his colleagues to support the AHC bill because he was the sponsor. Just for awareness, the AHC bill was passed unanimous, 63-0 in the New York State Senate. And I believe Senator Corrigan was part of that whipping of his colleagues to make sure that the Republicans did not support the bill. But it showed that we first started off with no support from the Rural Conference and becoming best friends with the Rural Conference, having no support with members of the minority, having full support of the New York State legislature, New York State Senate. In my opinion, it's all about convincing a coalition bill.
So I just want, if it's Jim Gordon, he's part of the Democratic caucus, and has been very supportive. If that's who you're talking about, just to expand on that, I would say that Long Island is really lucky. We have an amazing Senate base, of individuals now between Senator, as you mentioned, Anna Kaplan, and so many others that, really understand the complexities of these issues and are our advocates. I would just add, though, I think before we are asking for more, at least when we look at sort of the national level, even the state level, we've got to make sure we take what we're offered, and that's a really big challenge when you look at development on Long Island, in particular, when we talk about sewer and water or potential infrastructure development or other, when some of those dollars come with certain requirements, i.e. inclusionary zoning. If we don't have the right policies in place to receive those dollars, it's very difficult to try to make any case for getting more money. So I think, and that this goes back to sort of the voting pitch, which is, as Cottrell, also illuminated a variety of the other dollars that are available in this Reconciliation Act. If we don't have the right people in place to really create the flow of those funds to us as a region, we're going to be even further behind, from a housing and a development perspective than we are now.
Phil Boyle. Phil Boyle.
Oh, Phil. Okay, that makes, and Phil's another great representative for Long Island who totally gets it. So that makes sense.
Chris, to try to respond to your question, I think it's not just for this issue, it's for everything. Long Island is not considered a worthy spot. And, whether it's foundation funding or whether it's investment in housing. And I do think that it will require a much broader coalition that can kind of work on that, can kind of present Long Island in a way that is real, but also in a way that's not just, I can't think of a nice way to say this, but sometimes what happens is people are pimping off of poor communities in the region. And so that is not what should happen either. But I think that we can find the right mix that says, Long Island, you need to step up and do these things, like inclusive zoning and things of that nature. And we also collectively will advocate for certain investments that need to be made in Long Island. But we can't just hold on to the old ways and hold on to the system that says you have to live in the right school district before you get the resources. You have to live in the right communities, and those communities are racially, we know that our communities are racially segregated. And so we have got to really, finally dislodge ourselves from this embedded structural racism that basically characterizes everything for us, and say, when you give us the money, it really is going to benefit everybody. It's not just, the time is past for people to be in the mode that says, well, my community, we give more to the state and we don't get enough back. It's the region we should be concerned about. And the region's strength is only going to be as strong as its weakest link. So that's what we need to be concerned about.
And I see Susan has a question, but Elaine, that's what I mean when I mean coalition and whipping the votes in the state legislature, whether that's the legislature or in Congress. I can tell you from now representing Westchester, but when we were just New York City, when we go up to Albany, everybody likes to punch up on New York City, right? You're fine, you're good, you don't need anything. But that is like that when you don't have a coalition of anybody, right? So if you're just New York City, everybody can punch up on New York City. But if it's New York City and Buffalo and Rochester and Albany, it's very hard to beat up on that coalition. And it's the same for Long Island. If Long Island just stands alone, everybody goes, it's just Long Island, and it's a small delegation. And look, just based on the politics of Long Island, we don't even know if that senator is going to be here next year because there might be an election. And, I really don't want to get too testy. So if you partner up with the New York City delegation and partner up with your delegation upstate, it's much harder for someone like the majority leader or someone like the chairman to say, I'm not going to waste my time on Long Island issues when I have to worry about the whole state. It does become the whole state, as Elaine is saying, when there's multiple senators saying, go back to my baby bill, right? AHC is good for all of us. It helps everybody. It's not just a New York City bill. It's not just a Long Island bill, but Senator Kennedy in Buffalo also gets AHC money. It makes no sense why we all would not want to see an increase. When they start to hear, when the finance chair starts to hear that and the majority leader starts to hear that, it's much harder for them to fight their whole conference.
Right.
To not.
Yeah, we have a concrete example of that as well. We organized a state coalition that focused on amending the New York State human rights law to include legal source of income as a protected class. And, that passed in 2019, and it was a full-on state coalition. Some people were coming from some names that I had not heard of before. Being a downstate person, you don't know all of the places upstate, and it made a difference because different people can get to different elected officials, make a difference. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think that this idea of coalition building as a solution, to address many of these barriers that from a Long Island level can seem intractable, I think really makes a lot of sense. We're certainly seeing this also too in public health, recognizing that you can't sort of segregate a virus. And so the idea that, what are some of the ways to collectively act are needed. And again, just recognizing and lifting that up, that this is something that is, sounds like a wonderful strategy for us to be able to employ. Susan Ryan, thank you for being so patient. So if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself, you're welcome to ask your question.
There we go. Sorry. Hi, Elaine and Gwen. Good to see you. And Cottrell, you've been wonderful. I have a question. In terms of the groups that you were mentioning that cannot be discriminated against, are the physically disabled involved in that? It just wasn't mentioned. Is that one of the protected groups? I assume it is.
Yes, it is.
I believe, yes, I was going to say, I believe so. And I know the state has asked the Treasury for further definitive guidance on that, because my understanding, and folks on the panel correct me if I'm wrong, is this is a new term that the Treasury has created for the Housing Assistance Fund purposes that include both income bracket guidelines and then population definition guidelines. And the state has asked for further clarification from the Treasury, and I'm happy to share that once we hear if they've provided that guidance or if they've left it open to some interpretation by state.
Great. My question is, I have somebody that I worked with a long time ago, and I don't even know where to tell this person to go. He's in a wheelchair, lives in Suffolk County, is in a situation where he must have housing. He's physically disabled, so it's got to be accessible. And he makes under $30,000 a year. So he is looking for, he applied for Section 8 did the lottery, it didn't go, he wasn't able to get that. Where would I direct somebody like that in terms of, his additional issue is that it would have to be an accessible housing unit. And I guess he would be looking for renting in Nassau County. So I didn't even know where to start. I, gave him the basics, but that hasn't been enough. So.
Susan, we're welcome. I mean, you can certainly have him reach out to me and I can direct him to someone on our team,
Right.
Without getting into the weeds and his sort of
Right,
personal
right,
information.
right.
There's opportunities based on potential income, age, if he is a veteran. Unfortunately, we have a housing crisis, right? And so oftentimes, we have so many individuals that are financially constrained, and
Right.
there's not enough units, and there are procedures to some of the state and federal programs, like you mentioned, in terms of lotteries and wait lists and
Right.
program closures.
And there's
So
not
we
enough
will-
there. So, yeah.
Exactly. So we can certainly do our best and
Right.
help direct, but I can't make unfortunately, any promises for all of those reasons.
All right. I really appreciate that, because it is a matter of the time too. He's been, always gainfully employed, and was just the level of, he's kind of caught in this crunch where, it's an emergency. He's got to get out of where he is. He's financially not able to do that, but he does work. He's not on assistance. So he's higher than if he was, on public assistance, I guess. So.
Right. And
kind of a
it's all
catch-22
compounded
for
right
him.
now with the moratorium.
Right.
While there are, to Martine's earlier statistics, there's so many great benefits
Right.
that come out of, having that moratorium in place. It also means there's
Mhm.
less movement of people among, around units or within units. And so there's the
Right.
inventory is
low.
unbelievably limited.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. I will do that, Gwen. Thanks. Great workshop.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we're not done yet. There's still more. So just thinking about this in terms of, would love to leave folks with just some thoughts and ideas of some practical, applications for this, because I'm assuming that most of the people, the reasons why they tune in is they might be familiar with many of the sort of baseline issues that we have discussed and that you have all brought up. But really, I'm just thinking about, if you wouldn't mind, as a sort of thoughts from our panelists about really thinking about these issues around fair and affordable housing, especially as we recognize the sort of impact that COVID-19 has had, the potential for the reconciliation funding, the recognition that perhaps we have seen some sort of softening, or at least understanding among residents of Long Island, in terms of understanding our history and the significant role that housing plays. Help us out here and think about some of these sort of some practical tips, some ways that the folks on this call can sort of use this moment to be able to, for us to move this across.
And could I just jump up, piggyback on that very briefly? And given that we have a significant number of students on the call, perhaps also tips that young folks coming out of college, the ways that they can contribute.
Because I'll also, just to tie that together, that is the one thing that keeps me going, is working with students to be able to recognize that, just talking about, as Elaine was mentioning, with the segregated school districts, I have students who went to Syosset and are like, I'm embarrassed in a way to say that I'm from there, because of their recognition of the sort of history that sort of it holds in some circles. So again, thinking about that for sort of practical advice for a very hopefully responsive audience. See, I know who wants me first. Oh, Elaine, thank you.
Sure. So first of all, please tell your students that it's not their fault. However, we should hold ourselves accountable that once we know, we can't go back to not knowing. And so let me give some tips, because hopefully that's the direction they'll go in, not the feeling guilty direction. So one thing, this isn't quite for students so much, but oh yes, it is, I'm sorry. One thing that can be done, and the students can tell their parents to do this. If you are from a place like Syosset, let's say, and you see a sign go up, somebody is selling their house, you know, call up or visit the realtor and say, we live in the community and we want to make sure that anyone who asks, who says they want to see this home is provided an opportunity to do that, that you are not making assumptions about people who live in the community not wanting people from certain racial or ethnic groups. So that's something I'm asking people to start doing, because, you know, the realtors will say that part of the reason why they break the law, if they admit to breaking the law, and most of them don't, but, you know, when they get into that mode, they say it's because they're afraid of what the people in the neighborhood are going to say, you know, and they hear that the owner doesn't want them to bring certain folks like Black folks or Latinx folks or Asian folks. So that's one thing. Another thing is there are groups like ours who always need folks who are interested in advocating for certain kinds of civil rights policies. And so you should, you know, look folks up. You can look us up, eraseracismny.org, and just think realistically about your timing. But there may be something that you can do around advocating for some policies that do come up when laws do come up, making those phone calls. You know, as I mentioned earlier about the governor, she needs to sign some bills, the fair housing bills. And so it'd be good for her to hear from a lot of different people about that. I also think that when the builders like CDCLI and other builders are trying to build multifamily housing, it can't be just the people who are opposed that show up for the public hearing. We need people, other people, to show up, residents in that particular community, to show up and say, I support this development. What the elected officials will say is that, you know, I have to be concerned about my constituency, and the constituency they hear are the ones that are screaming, no, no way, we don't want that. And so that's another, you know, step to be taken. You know, and if you are, you know, if you're not one to go to a meeting, that doesn't mean you can't pick up a piece of paper or send an email or something to let people know what you think. And then the other thing with, in terms of your circle, sometimes change is made, it's easier to make change close to you. So your friends and families, family members, and other students. Silence is a terrible thing. And I think that there is way too much silence when conversations are had, when comments are made, we kind of let them go. Even though some people think, that wasn't really such a great comment to make. That sounded a little discriminatory, but let's not let things go. And we need people working in their own circle to do this work with your own, you know, that Uncle Henry or whoever it is, your cousins, your siblings. We need people to, we started by talking about the problem of racism and how it manifests. And we need to have a lot more people who are able to understand and and some of those ideas be challenged by people that they know and love.
Wonderful, thank you. Great advice and tips, actionable tips. Gwen, any thoughts?
Sure, I would obviously echo, you know, Elaine's comments. I would also say, you know, for me, sort of watching what has transpired over the past year and a half, that the efforts of the Gen X and the millennial population and communities has been unbelievably inspiring, that they have not tolerated and will not tolerate many of the practices and policies and outright discrimination and violence that was demonstrated and continues to be demonstrated against communities. So in some ways, it's how do we support you? You know, what can we do to get behind the way you are mobilizing amongst each other, because it's amazing and it needs to continue. And with that, I would just add, you know, to speak up. You know, to Elaine's point, while it may seem intimidating going to a zoning meeting or a planning meeting or a town board meeting, even if there's not a development, you know, when you see that there's a meeting, in particular on Zoom, to kind of get yourself started, just share a comment for 30 seconds that you want to see housing opportunities in your community. You want to be able to live in your community. You want your friends to be able to live in your community. That the more that our elected officials can hear that, the more likely they are to be able to support the different types of developments that may come forward. And also, you know, speak up, to Elaine's point, in different circles. You know, we hear continuously, unfortunately, even after the great job that Newsday did in terms of their investigation, we have a mobility coaching program with many of our housing choice voucher participants. They'll go out with one of our coaches and the real estate broker will say point blank, oh no, the landlord's not accepting programs. Oh no, the landlord's not accepting that type of, oh, it's a voucher? No, they don't. Oh no, the landlord's not accepting families. They don't want young children. And so of course, rolled in this, we all know what's rolled in it, but you don't have an option. That's discrimination. It's illegal. And so if that happens, that should be reported. And whether it's through Elaine, whether it's through the Department of Human Rights, whether it's through some of the other legal groups on Long Island, people should really feel empowered to express and share and call people out on that. And finally, I will say, from sort of a out of despair comes opportunity, is, you know, one of the things we saw with COVID and COVID-19, and even really prior to that, was this mass shift away from these large box stores, large commercial and retail spaces, and these strip malls. And with there being lots of closures there, there's an opportunity for housing development in a cross section of different communities, not just, you know, simply siloed to one or two communities, but across the island in general. And that's a great place, again, for individuals to use their voice. There's sewer, there's water infrastructure connected to those properties to say, this is what I want to see there. This is what's going to make our community stronger. So the more that people, you know, use their voice and realize their voice is just as important as anyone else's to really move for change, I think the more effective we can be, to Cottrell's point, as a collective, collaborative voice.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Got it. And finally, Cottrell, any inspiring words, or at least even practical tips and advice?
I thank Elaine and Gwen said it. It just sounds very cliche, but it is reaching out to your elected official. And, you know, I think as we talk about this reconciliation and infrastructure bill, you know, we have to, I had a friend, and I tell everybody all the time, that says, New York is the new Kentucky, and we need to start acting like it, right? We have the majority leader. And the idea that we are going from $600 billion, $340 billion, and might be going lower, right? Like, the majority leader needs to hear that New York, Long Island, New York City, Westchester does not support that. We need money. Right? Gwen needs money to build. I need money to build. We need to stop playing this game that we are not trying to house people. We're trying to house people. And it's, again, coalition building. Building a coalition with fellow students to reach out to your elected official, your congressman, and telling them, right, like, this is where your constituency supports. So it sounds cliche. I used to work on political campaigns. Trust me, when those calls start to come in, elected officials listen, because elected officials, I tell everybody all the time, elected officials know how to count two things, and that's money and people. And you being able to call and say that you're a constituent is them counting people. They start to get the point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that really says all. Chris, any final words?
Yep, I just want to thank all of our panelists for the conversation. It was a wonderful and insightful, and I think also complemented our conversation this morning very well.
Absolutely, and I hope inspired the audience to recognize that we do have this power to collectively act, and this is a historic moment. And with folks like our panelists, I think we are at least in the best hands possible, but it also takes that coalition and that people power. So let's make it happen, people. Come on. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.